You are living in an unnatural sea, and I think that's the best word, like an ocean, an unnatural ocean of electromagnetic energies. That's my concern in an area with an abundance of transmitters and antennas is at any point in time, you're being exposed to the gamut. I mean, every possible power level in the millimeter radiation spectrum.
Every new thing is the next level, but this is like a next level. And so I love you to kind of dive into that and maybe break that down a little bit for our audience.
Regard to the millimeter wave stuff, it is just absolutely crazy what's going on there now. And I just started a three-part, might be a four-part series on my Substack that deals with, what exactly is 5G, because a lot of this millimeter stuff is conflated with 5G. The really unfortunate thing is I think we were all led to believe that 5G high band, so to speak, was being conflated with millimeter wave radiation. So this is going to be like the first time in history humans are going to be exposed to millimeter wave radiation is with this terrible specter that we're meant to be afraid of, 5G that's getting rolled out. And what I found, I was asked to be a beta tester for the first really helpful millimeter wave product with the correct level of accuracy, sensitivity, and third party certification that so I could use in my work. So it was my first view into millimeter wave radiation in the environment. I was super excited because, you have to have a particular piece of equipment to be able to see a particular phenomenon. And I had heard a lot about millimeter wave tech, and I didn't have any way of seeing if it was there. And my most sensitive clients, we live in a very rural, remote area in the inland Northwest, about 50 miles from the Canadian border. So it's pretty peaceful up here, and I figured we were going to be spared the horrors of millimeter wave 5G implementation, and we have been. But I found there was already environmental exposure of 5G, excuse me, millimeter wave radiation. And if you buy food or you travel, not only are you being exposed right now, but you've been exposed for a long time. How long? I don't know. Long enough for every grocery store in the area we live, and we have a national chain, a couple of regional chains, and a local chain. To walk into any of those grocery stores, you're going to be exposed to really intense millimeter wave radiation. We know there's a lot of different ways to open the door for people. You don't need to use millimeter wave radiation to open a door to get into a supermarket. There's a lot of different ways to solve that problem. So, why all the grocery stores now bathe their customers in millimeter wave radiation when they go in to shop? I don't know. I don't know. One woman shared with me that her child can't go into a supermarket because he goes into seizures, and I wonder if that's why. I sometimes feel slightly disoriented when I walk in the door. I wonder if that's why. So, who said that was okay? And why did anybody make that decision? Should we not be careful with radiation exposures of all types and be cautious, especially where women and children are possibly being exposed? So that was unfortunately what I'm saying is even in this rather peaceful area where I live, if you want to buy groceries, you're going to get exposed. Now we have one grocery store out of four that has a delicatessen door. You know, you push it open, and that one you can go in with no millimeter wave radiation exposure. So that's something I've tried to let my local followers know about. The other thing is we have other millimeter wave exposures that have been increasing. They've been in place since at least 2009, and it has to do with vehicular radar. So, millimeter wave radiation emitters, intentional radiators on vehicles for the purpose of things like adaptive cruise control, collision avoidance, backup, these different things. And I wonder whether it's worth it. I wonder whether it's worth it to have everybody in the population now exposed to millimeter wave radiation. And let's just assume the health effects are unknown. Well, where's our control group going to be if we ever want to, make sense out of what's going on with a new disease in the future or whatever? So sadly, what I learned is even in beautiful places, you can't avoid millimeter wave radiation exposure that has absolutely nothing to do with 5G cell service, 5G telephony. So these two are not to be conflated, millimeter wave radiation and 5G. It's it's broader than that. So then we can talk about the 5G cell service and the millimeter wave aspect of that. And what I see as the greatest danger there might surprise you, but we'll kind of go through this a little bit at a time. I mentioned earlier that the higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength, the greater the energetic potential of the photons. That's well accepted. So when you get into the millimeter wave radiation, much, much more energetic, therefore, a need for to push harder, and the distance that these things can travel and retain that energy is shorter, still governed by the inverse square law. But all of this boils down to meaning you have to have a multitude of, transmitters and antennas to serve. And by the way, I say serve with air quotes because in the 21st century, serve and service means exposure to a sea of unnatural radiation. Cell phone service, Wi Fi service, 5G service. It means you are in a sea of unnatural radiation. No sea of unnatural radiation, no service. So, what a weird turn of language, right? Yeah, I want service. Anyway, so you want to have 5G cell service, millimeter wave, the fastest variety possible. It's going to involve a huge number, a dramatic increase in the number of transmitters and antennas in a particular area. So the danger that I see, other than it's totally untested, we know all forms of harmful man-made electromagnetic radiation up to this point have been harmful. We don't know how much more harmful millimeter wave is going to be. It's untested. They introduced it before any of the testing. So now we're going to make a huge number of transmitters in certain areas, metropolitan areas, sporting stadiums, things like that. And then I mentioned my concern might be a little bit different than you would think. It is because there is no safe level of exposure. I think Neil Cherry and others were among the first to state that and prove it. The only known level of exposure, safe level of exposure, is actually zero. And I don't mean zero on a cheap meter. I mean zero out to, 16 decibels. And Arthur Furstenberg has just written a beautiful paper demonstrating, among other things, sometimes there's an inverse relationship between power intensity and physiological effect. That's a mind blower, right? So there are experiments that have been conducted at a certain power density level, and then they repeated it with a power density 1,000 times lower and found a greater physiological effect. So let that soak in. Sometimes a smaller exposure can cause a more dramatic physiological effect. That's my concern in an area with an abundance of transmitters and antennas is at any point in time, you're being exposed to the gamut. I mean, every possible power level in the millimeter radiation spectrum from the highest level with your nearest transmitter to the one 14 blocks away that you can't measure. You know, it's below zero on even the best meter you have, but the inverse square law does not go to zero. You know, no, these energies are infinite. So that's my take on what one of the things that's going to be really harmful about the 5G cell service millimeter wave.